Over the last hour or so, it's our breaking news here in RT. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered the withdrawal of the bulk of Russian military forces from Syria. He said the Defence Ministry's main mission there had been accomplished. Russia's permanent naval base in Tartus and a permanent air base too in Latakia province will continue to operate as before. The withdrawal was agreed with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and in a phone conversation, the Russian and Syrian leaders expressed their hope that the peace talks, which started today in Geneva, will bring visible results. The Russian president has also said the actions of Russian troops in Syria has allowed the peace process to get going.
In a short period of time, Russia created a small but very effective military group in Syria. The effective work of our military forces allowed the peace process to begin. I think the task of Russia's defense ministry and the Russian troops is in general complete. Syrian government troops and patriotic forces can change the situation in the fight with international terrorism and can seize the initiative.
Russia's defense minister has stressed that Russian strikes have helped to cut off the routes supplying the terrorists.
With the airstrikes, we managed to reduce and in some areas to completely cut off the supply lines of the terrorists' trade in hydrocarbons. The main routes of the trade with Turkey have been cut off, as well as the main routes which provided the terrorists with weapons.
OK, well, I think we can go back now to our correspondent, Lizzie Phelan, who's been waiting patiently in Damascus. We lost the line with her a few moments ago, but she's back. Lizzie, we were talking about the Syrian opposition groups fighting against the Syrian government, but over the last couple of weeks you mentioned that many of them had sort of changed their tone and their tack, and we're now looking in a more sort of conciliatory way when it comes to dealing with the Syrian government.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, prior to Russia launching its air campaign, there was absolutely no question in most of the opposition's minds about negotiating with the Syrian government. However, almost on a daily basis, reconciliation deals are being reached with many of the factions and the Syrian government. You have to bear in mind that there's hundreds, if not more than 1,000 different factions amongst the opposition in Syria. So this has been a hugely significant development. We travelled to the north of the country, to Afrin province, where the Syrian Democratic Forces largely control that province, predominantly the Kurdish militia, the YPG, and they have an unofficial cooperation with the Syrian government now for some time. We also spoke to one of the founders of a 5-year-old Free Syrian Army faction called Jaish al-Thawar. His name was Abu Joma al-Banawi, who said that now his group has no intention of continuing to fight the Syrian government. It's only interested in fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, and that once those groups are defeated, his group will lay down arms and work for security to return to Syria. So these are huge developments that prior to Russia launching its campaigns almost seemed unthinkable. And apart from the military developments on the ground, because of Russia's involvement, including huge gains in various provinces in Syria, for example, in Latakia, almost the entire province has been declared free of extremist groups. In Aleppo, there's been huge gains. There's also been huge gains on the humanitarian front, with humanitarian aid finally reaching besieged areas after years. And the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke about this today in a press conference. Let's take a quick listen to what he had to say.
We created an international group which included all the key players and regional powers as well. The agreements reached by this group on the political process in Syria have been backed by 2 resolutions by the UN Security Council. They include the ceasefire, humanitarian aid to previously blocked off areas, and the start of peace talks. Thanks to these agreements, including your latest agreement with Barack Obama, today in Geneva we saw the peace talks resume.
Now, back to the status of the opposition groups since the Russian campaign begun, not only have many opposition groups begun to talk to the Syrian government, but as I mentioned earlier, many of them have had to distance themselves from extremist groups like ISIS and al-Nusra. Prior to Russia stepping up its involvement in Syria, many of the opposition groups, like the Free Syrian Army, were either more willing or forced to align themselves with, especially with groups like al-Nusra, who are regarded as much more powerful on the ground. But especially since that cessation of hostilities that came into effect a couple of weeks ago, largely because of the Russian initiative, now many opposition groups are in fact distancing themselves from those extremist groups and creating huge divisions amongst them. So that's also an extremely important development on the ground here.
And just briefly, Lizzie, people might be surprised that Russia has reached this point today, because they only started their campaign a matter of months ago, but have now decided they have achieved enough to withdraw the bulk of their forces. Can you just run through the achievements that they have made, and particularly in the west of the country?
Right, well, as I already mentioned, Latakia province and Aleppo, particularly in Aleppo, to go into a little more detail, the Islamic State has been largely pushed back, especially since the Syrian army managed to take a key air base there several months ago that we covered literally a day after the siege, and it was broken. It was under siege by ISIS forces for around 3 years. There's been huge gains also in the Damascus province, and all of this has essentially pushed the opposition to accept that cessation of hostilities, which largely, well, generally has been successful. There's been a huge reduction of violence on the ground here.
OK, but on that point, there are still sporadic outbursts, aren't there, and duels that are taking place. And you yourself were actually sort of caught up in Mortify, weren't you, just the other day too? I mean, life, we shouldn't assume, is going back to normal anytime soon in Syria.
No, and of course there will be a concern that if Russia does substantially withdraw its forces here in Syria, that would be a kind of temptation for the opposition in particular to begin trying to to regain the losses that they've suffered since Russia got involved in late September last year. There are daily breaches of the ceasefire, as you mentioned just yesterday when we were filming in the city that's regarded as the cradle of the uprising in Dara. While we were filming, there was a couple of mortars that landed very close to where we were filming. So the cessation of hostilities, while it's generally holding, it is still extremely fragile. So there will be a lot of concern amongst people here, especially supporters of the Syrian government, that those gains that they've won since late September last year may be rolled back.
OK, Lizzie, look, thanks very much. We'll leave it there for the moment. That was our correspondent, Lizzie Phelan, live there from Damascus. Well, the announcement of Russia withdrawing the largest part of its forces from Syria does come on the eve of the 5th anniversary of the civil war in the country.
Total collapse of any effort by the Assad government to work with their own people. He needs to get out of the way.
It's quite clear that this is a regime that is hell-bent on killing, murdering and maiming its own citizens.
I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.